Before I begin, I'm going to raise an emotional issue for you guys. How's that? Did you notice that when I began to talk about the spirit body and those kind of concepts, all of a sudden all of you start to increase your energy, your interest increased substantially. Did you notice that? And you notice when I was talking about love, truth and humility, the interest is not so high. Did you notice that?
I did, was interesting.
Yeah. Now, this is a generalisation for the audience. The fact that your interest in the spirit body and the discussion about the spirit body and the soul and those kind of discussions is higher is an indication that you are more interested in metaphysics than you are in love. And remember I said to you that actually these three principles have the highest amount of laws involved in them, they have the highest amount of truths involved in them, and they are going to be necessary for your complete future development, like right the way through eternally, your eternal future development. Now, what that indicates to me is the same as what it indicates to me when I visit many other audiences, and that is we have this very strong interest and desire to talk about the nuts and bolts of things, but a very low interest and desire to talk about the real things that control our entire life. And this is where I feel the majority of audiences that I'm speaking to still don't understand these particular three things. They feel that that's boring and this discussion is more interesting. You see, for me it's the exact opposite to that. I find this discussion boring and this discussion more interesting. And as you develop further and further in love and truth, you will find the same shift happening inside of yourself. You will actually find your interest in the physical phenomena is actually reduces in comparison to your interest in the laws surrounding the true development of your soul. So what I would suggest to you to do throughout this further discussion that we go through now, I'll discuss some of these nuts and bolts things here, these physical phenomena, if you could call it that. But what I would love to do is to refer them back to this so that you can see the relationship between understanding this inside of your heart. Now, in the first century I used a statement or a slogan. I said, out of the heart's abundance, the mouth speaks. You've heard that sound? There's a quote from, that's now in the Bible. Your questions come out of your heart's abundance. The fact that you're more questioning of these things, the physical phenomena, means the heart is more connected to the physical phenomena. And it's less connected to these principles of love, truth and humility. Now, I would like to suggest to you that in time, if you can develop a desire to be more connected to these. Can I illustrate? When I talk about love, there is literally thousands of laws involved in the aspect of love. And yet we've not even yet discussed one of them. With truth, when I talk about truth, there are literally millions of truths that you can actually discern and find out about. And yet we ask very few questions about them. And in regard to humility, there is a lot of emotional content in our souls, and yet we have very little interest in discovering it. And yet, those three things are the essential parts of your future life's progression. This is now discussing what actually happens. This is discussing how you can discover what happens. Now, to me, how is better always to learn how than it is to learn what. It's a bit like there's this old saying, isn't there, that you can teach a man, you can give a man a fish or you can teach him how to fish. Right? When I'm talking about these things with you, I'm giving you a fish. When I talk about this with you, I'm teaching you how to fish. There's a big difference between those two places. And the fact that we are more interested in this means we're more interested in getting a fish than we are in learning how to fish. And that is an issue that we have to face.
Why isn't that natural for us to take our focus on that one?
There are some very good reasons why. One primary reason why is that on the earth we are so used to having someone else tell us or give us things, rather than having to go through the process of self-discovery. We want other people who have already discovered it to just tell us, so that we don't have to go through the actual process ourselves of self-discovery. And that is a major problem for our future development, because in the end all of us are totally capable of discovering ourselves the truths of the universe, rather than needing another person. But unfortunately, because of the way we've been brought up generally, we always are focusing too much on needing other people to tell us, rather than being taught how to do it ourselves. And if you look at all of our education, all the way through primary school and high school, I don't know what school, different layers of schools you have here, but in Australia we have a primary school and a secondary education, and then we have university education. If you look all the way through these forms of education that we take nowadays, most of the time we're being taught like what rather than how, unfortunately. And in particular, anything to do with our soul, we very rarely learn how, and mostly are taught what. Mary?
To me, it feels like learning has become a vulnerable
Thing for humanity. It feels
Yes.
like a fear-inducing exercise to say, I don't know, I have to learn. There's uncertainty, and instead of...
She's speaking about it loud as you can.
Yeah, sorry. I was saying that to me it feels like the process of learning has
become vulnerable for humanity. We feel vulnerable when we don't know something. We feel open to humiliation or judgment. And it feels to me that when we're children, there's wonder in our learning, but that is quickly replaced with a sense of I'm less than if I don't know. And that's why I feel like we want to know, we want the fish instead of learning how to fish.
Yeah. So when we're a child, what Mary's basically stating is when we're a child, we have this wonder in everything, this joy of discovery in everything generally. But as we grow, it's normally suppressed throughout our experience. A lot of times through punishment. Don't you know that already? What's wrong with you? You know, those kind of statements cause us to be resistive to the process of learning. And now we either want to be told or we won't admit anything. We can't even admit that we don't know anymore, because we're not allowed to. We're not allowed to get away with it without being ridiculed in some way. And this is a major problem too for humanity. The third reason why it's a major problem is that love is not seen on the earth as something very important. A case in point is that we readily revert to violence, which is an indication of how much love is not important to us. Also, truth is not seen as very important because most of us have become disillusioned with the potential discovery of universal truth. We become disillusioned because we're taught all these different things and none of them seem to make full sense to us. And so after a while we go, oh, well, there's that possibility, and there's that possibility, but I don't really know what the truth is. And it seems the more we learn, the less we're certain about. And my suggestion, if we were actually learning divine truth, the more we learn, the more we're certain about. So it's sort of the opposite. But unfortunately on earth there's this general viewpoint that the more you learn, the less you're certain about, and so there's more doubt and therefore more confusion. And then a lot of people decide to stop learning for that reason, because it just feels like there's too much for confusion to add some more confusion too. And so we become very resistant to the process of learning after that. So I feel there are a lot of emotional reasons why we are less interested in these things and more interested in these things. Yeah?
But we are not going in the way of love. We have been living for many years now, and I think that we are not going in the way of knowledge.
I agree.
And you are talking about it, and many people are talking about it, and we can understand it, but in some way we don't take it to us.
Well, the problem is that we think we understand it. But the problem with with love in particular is that love is a feeling and an emotion, and it has to be felt to be understood. And so, unfortunately, we can listen to a talk that talks about love or humility or truth, and we think, yeah, I get that, I get that, I get that, I get that. And then in the very next thing we do, we're unloving. So that tells me I don't get it. Like, it was interesting in my recent discussion that I had with a group of about 50 or 60 people in England, and one man up the front was very rude and interruptive all the time, and I said to him, I'm here to speak with you about love, and you're demonstrating through your conduct that you have no understanding of it, and yet you want to ask me questions about everything else. And yet you're being rude. He was being rude, interrupting other people's questions and everything. And after a while I had to ask him to leave. Now he was a man who intellectually thought he was very developed, that he understood all of these different things, and yet his very actions were proving that he had no understanding of what I was talking about at the time. Yeah. And this is what we need to be aware of. If we are truly going to develop and truly understand the universe, we need to begin by understanding love. And we need to begin by understanding the only reason why I don't understand love is because I don't have a love of truth. And the only reason why I don't have a love of truth is because I'm not humble enough to accept the truth. And if we understand those basic principles, we can grow immensely in our life. And somebody asked me earlier, I think it was Johan, to describe myself and Mary's progression through our life from 2,000 years ago to now. And it all happened because of these things. Not because of... At the beginning I understood none of this. None of it. And I personally had not experienced any of it. And it was only through understanding this that I came to understand that. When I say understand, completely understand how it all works and how it all fits together and what goes on. But that was impossible without first understanding this. And I feel the comment that you've made is very true, that the proof in the earth is that we are not that attracted to love yet. Because the proof is we look around us and we can see that love isn't what guides our entire society. It's other things. And if you look at the different ways that nations work with other nations, you can see quite clearly that love doesn't guide nations, unfortunately, yet. My feelings are, in the future, once some of us make this switch over into having more of a fascination with these topics, now we'll have the ability to change our soul. Now love will guide, eventually, communities and then nations. And once love guides nations, it's going to be amazing what happens on the earth after that. Because once you're in a loving environment, you are free to investigate everything else. But when you're not in a loving environment and we're worried about our day-to-day health and our day-to-day welfare and our day-to-day activities and whether we're going to die tomorrow or not because of a war or some kind of attack or terrorist thing or whatever, now we can't develop as freely because we don't have an environment that's been created for development. It's the same as you place a child. Every single child is capable of learning, yes? Very, very rapidly. There was one child that I met, 5 years of age, 7 languages. Spoke 7 languages. Just because of the combination of events that happened in its life, and it had the grandparents and the parents all knew different languages, and they all spoke them very regularly. The child grew up 5 years of age, 7 languages. Now, I don't know the English very well, as you can often see. Now, why is that? Because there's an impediment to learning that's created in our very young environment. And the impediments to learning are all about fear. They're all about what happens in our childhood environment that causes us to fear, that causes us to feel emotions that are unpleasant, that we feel like we can't feel. And what we need to do collectively is change our environment so that love allows learning. You see, fear doesn't allow learning. Love allows learning. And when we love each other, we now are allowed to have different opinions and different points of view. So what I'm presenting here, you don't have to agree with. I love you enough to allow you to not agree with it. Right? Now, the problem with humanity generally is we don't love other people enough to allow them to have a different opinion. But the other problem we have is that we all don't understand love enough to see what love would do in any particular situation or circumstances. So I feel that these are the crux of our development. This is, while fascinating, and I do find it fascinating personally, all through my life I've found physical things and scientific things fascinating. That's always been the case. But I still feel more fascination about this. If I can put it another way, to me this is the skeleton by which, or the laws by which, this operates. So when I talk about this, I'm talking about how everything works together. When I talk about this, I'm talking about what works. This, I'm talking about how it all fits. And to me, that's why, to me, this is more fascinating. It has a much more fascinating interest for myself, and particularly the aspect of love and truth and my own humility have a far more fascinating effect on me than discussing this. Now, discussing this is great from a understanding perspective and helping you to come to terms with what might be ahead of you. But if you understand this, you will accept anything that's ahead of you, no matter what it is. Do you understand the difference? So this here describes something that I've personally experienced, but it doesn't help you in that it doesn't help you cope with it. It doesn't help you absorb it. It doesn't help you experience it. This is what will help you experience it, this part. So this is why I see the difference between the two subjects is very, very important. Yeah? That being said, I'm happy to discuss these principles because all of us are obviously fascinated with different spiritual things that go on in our lives, and it's lovely to learn from somebody or to discuss with people who have already been there to a degree. So, you know, when I'm sitting down with a scientist discussing things like radiation, for example, then I'm fascinated in that discussion. It's not something that I've personally been involved in much in my life, in this life in particular. And so I'm fascinated with that discussion. I want to absorb that. But I understand that understanding that is all about this too. Exactly the same.